Welcome back to the channel, chess fans, and get ready for a fantastic clash from the 2025 FIDE World Cup. In this ruthless knockout tournament, where every move determines survival, we are shining a spotlight to the compelling matchup of international talent. On one side, we have Nigeria's champion, FM Bomo Lovet Kigigha, a powerful presence in African chess and a four-time Nigerian chess champion. On the other hand, we feature the young ambitious force from Germany, GM Alexander Donchenko. Donchenko is one of the brightest talents on the circuit, having secured his spot among the elite by winning the 2023 Tata Steels Challengers and adding titles like the Barcelona Open, the Riga Technical University Open on his resume. Bomo's intense fighting spirit ensured this was a complex, tense struggle that proves the board is truly a level once the pieces start moving. Get ready to witness the defensive grit, sharp tactics, and the deep endgame as we break down every critical moment. If you love global chess content, hit the like button, subscribe to the Chessbox Worldwide channel, and in the white pieces, the four-time Nigerian chess champion, FIDE Master Bomo Lovet Kigigha opened the game with Knight F3, and Grandmaster Alexander Donchenko from Germany played D5, E3, Knight F6, B3, Bishop comes to F5, Bishop E2, H6, Bishop F3, putting an eye on the bishop in case the pawn moves out of the way. We exchange the bishops on the spot. Knight D7, standing that in case of pawn E6, then in case of bishop taking bishop, then the knight can always go back and take the bishop without disorganizing the castling rights of the king. Short castling from Bomo, E6, bishop takes F8, knight takes F8, D4, hitting in the center, knight comes back to D7, C4, and after short castling from Grandmaster Alexander, B4 from Bomo, Grandmaster played F5, challenging the B4 pawn expansion, B5, C5, en passant, pawn takes C6, pawn takes C6, C5, F4 from the Grandmaster. He's intending to bring the pawn further to F3 so that the rooks can always be taking control of the open file. Bishop D3, requesting for an exchange. Queen comes to F5, bishop takes F5, pawn takes F5, and it's a queen C2, attacking the pawn on F5. Knight comes to E4, defending the pawn instantly and cementing knight in the center. Looking at all the dark squares, knight comes to H4, hitting on the pawn which is on F5, G6, defending the pawn, F3, hitting on the knight, but this quotes another weakness which is on E3, which Bomo has to give time and look at in the future. Knight comes to G5. Now in case you go ahead and play F4, then the knight retreats back. So Bomo played knight C3. Now since the knight is aware, the knight can still develop on C3. Rook comes to E8, hitting on the pawn which is on E3. Rook comes to F1, defending F3, and now the rooks can always come in to put pressure on the queen side. Rook comes to B1, rook B8, king comes to, in case the rooks exchange, the king can be defending the pawn which is on E3. Alexander went on and played knight E6. But however, knight F6 was the best move in the position. And in case of rook takes B8, rook takes B8, we could see rook B1, rook B4. And in case of rook takes B4, queen takes B4. In case of queen coming to B3, queen takes B3, A takes B3. Since the knight is protecting the A2 square, then the knight sacrifice can be very powerful. Knight comes to E4 check, and I can tell you Alexander would go on to win the game. But however, after king F2, he played knight E6, and Bomo played G3, opening up a square for the knight to retreat just in case. Knight comes to G5, trying to look at the weakness which is on F3. Rook takes B8, rook takes B8, and it's rook B1, requesting for an exchange of rooks. Rook goes back to E8, but however, rook takes B1 should have been considered, but he played rook B3. Now he's putting an eye on the pawn which is on F3, played knight F6, Bomo played queen D3. Now H5, expanding on the king side, knight comes to G2, knight H3 check, and after king F1, queen A7. Now we see in this position, queen is now flexible, it can always protect, at the same time also put an eye on the pawn which is on E3. Remember also the knight is looking at all the dark squares. So in this position, Bomo went on and played knight F4, but however, knight E2 should have been considered. Now rerouting his other knight to sit on E4, but maintaining the knight still be here because knight is putting an eye on E3 and opening up the rook to attack the pawn supported by the queen. So queen D7, knight could come to F4, and after knight takes F4, G takes F4. But however, after queen A7, he played knight F4, and we see knight takes F4, G takes F4, and in this position, Grandmaster Alexander went on and played H4. Rook B8 should have been considered. And after rook takes B8, queen takes B8, queen B1, queen would come to A8, defending the pawn on F3 and still maintaining the queens on board, queen B3, and after queen comes to A6 check, king comes to F2, and queen D3, maneuvering and entering into white squares, queen takes F3, queen c2 check, and after knight would come to e2. But however, after pawn takes f4, he played h4, trying to bring in the knight. Knight e2 should have been considered. After knight comes to h5, rook takes f3. This would be a dominating position for Bomo. But however, after h4, he played knight b1, and Grandmaster went and played knight h5. Now he's putting an eye on the pawn. In the future, planning to bring the queen on e7 and put an eye, bring all those nasty checks which can be very dangerous in the position. So Bomo played rook takes f3, Grandmaster Alexander played queen e7. Now, the queen is putting an eye on the pawn which is on e3. There is a threat of knight taking pawn and threatening all the nasty checks. In this position, Bomo went on and played knight d2. But however, queen d2 should have been considered, opening up for the rook and also securing the e1 square by the queen. And in case of h3, we could see rook comes to b3, g5, knight c3, and after g4, queen f2, queen takes e3, rook takes e3, knight d1, hitting on the rook, and after rook goes back to e8. However, after queen e7, he played knight d2, and the Grandmaster played the best move. He played knight takes f4, and in this position, sacrificing the knight. In case of pawn takes f4, this is lost because of queen e1 check, and after king g2, rook comes into e2 check, and after king goes to h3, rook takes d2, and this would be dominating. But however, after knight takes f4, he played queen a6, putting an eye on the pawn which is on c6 and also opening up for the rook to defend the pawn on e3. In this position, Grandmaster Alexander played queen e6, king comes to f2, and he played knight h3 check, king goes back to e1, queen comes to f6. Since the rook has pinned the pawn, now the queen wants to go ahead and take the pawn which is on d4. He played queen f1, attacking the knight, and in this position, Grandmaster went on and played knight g5. But however, f4 was a very powerful response. And in case of pawn e4, d takes e4, f takes e4, after knight comes to g5, e5, queen f5. But however, let's go back. Queen f1. Grandmaster played knight g5, still maintaining the knights on the board and planning to go ahead and take the pawn. And in this position, Bomo played f4, hitting on the knight. Knight e4 should have been considered, followed by knight takes e4 and rook takes e4. But however, the Grandmaster didn't want to know if this is the best or this is not the best. He played queen takes d4. Since the rook has pinned the king, he went in and played queen takes d4 and sacrificed knight on g5. And indeed, Bomo Kigigha went on and played f takes g5. Grandmaster played f4, hitting on the pawn which is on e3. Remember also that the rook is putting an eye on the pawn which is on e3. e4 should have been considered, for example. e4 should have been played, and in case of queen b2, rook b3, queen e5, this would be a more equal position to be played by both players. But however, after f4, Bomo was so ambitious and he played rook d3, hitting on the queen, and it was in this position that the Grandmaster unveiled and removed his mask. He played rook takes e3, check, and after rook takes e3, he played pawn takes e3, hitting on the knight. Knight f3 should have been played, but he played knight b3. For example, in case of knight f3, hitting on the queen and also putting an eye on the pawn which is on h4, defending the pawn which is on h2, queen c3 check, after king comes into e2, queen c4 check, king e1, queen comes into e2, queen b1 check, queen d1, queen takes a2, queen comes into e2, queen b3. But however, after pawn takes e3, he played knight b3, and the Grandmaster seized the initiative and he played queen b2. He played queen d3, and the Grandmaster played queen f2 check, and after king d1, he played queen g1 check, and after king goes to e2, played queen takes h2. And I can tell you, the pawn on e3 is untouchable. For example, in the case of king takes e3, this is lost because of queen g3 check, king d4, queen takes d3, king takes d3, and after h3, if you look at this position, the king is out of the square. But however, after queen takes h2, he tried king d1, and the Grandmaster played queen g1 check, and after king comes back to c2, queen f2 check, king d1, and he played h3. And remember that this pawn is unstoppable, because even if you try moves like queen coming to e2, still the pawn will continue moving forward to be graduating into a queen. And it was in this position after move 49 that Bomo Kigigha, the 4-time Nigerian chess champion, resigned the game. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in your games.